Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Silver Years. My name is DK, and I'm very happy to be here, and I humbly thank you for joining me. Today is a new segment of my story time. My story time, for those who don't know, is where I tell my story as a way to counter the ever changing official narrative of history, his story. Because no one, not even AI, can tell my life story as a direct reflection of the times in which I lived better than me. And this is where I'm telling it. The story that wants to be told today has no real time frame or location because it's been with me since birth. It comes from my ancestors, really, and the epigenetic belief systems that are passed down through generations. It also comes from my own life experiences and my need for spiritual exploration beyond the traditions I was expected to continue. This is merely my interpretation of it all, my perceptions, and even my rejection of some of these belief systems. I briefly mentioned some of this influence in my four-part saga of husband number one link above. I'll put a link. And here is where I will go into depth with regards to my religious upbringing, influences, and experiences. Some would call this walking a path of spiritual self discovery. And it was my path, my experiences. And nothing I discuss in this video is meant to disparage or attack anyone or their belief systems. What you believe is on you, and we all have our own path to walk. This was mine. And this is only part one because this story warrants more than I can offer in one video. So, to begin part one of this segment, I'll need to go back in time to my great grandparents on my mother's side because their religious history had the strongest influence, I think, in the life that I've lived. Any influence from my father's side, grandparents and great grandparents, was nominal overall to the setup. My mother's grandmother, my great grandmother, was the mother of Mom Creck. Mom Creck was my mother's mother and my grandmother. I have mentioned Mom Creck several times throughout these My Storytime segments. I'll put a link to one that I did with her. We called my great grandmother, Mom Creck's mother, we called her Noni. Noni was married to Ed, my great grandfather. They were married in Iowa and they had three children, Mom Creck being the youngest. Her sister was the oldest, and the middle child was their brother. Noni was raised in a family that had Baptist and Methodist roots, but the influence from these belief systems wasn't heavy or oppressive. It appears that Noni and her siblings were raised with few religious restrictions and they had a lot of freedom to express themselves, especially given the times they grew up in, which would be the late 1800s. Late 1800s, circa turn of the century. Noni and Ed lived in Iowa around their large extended families and their farms. Ed was from a devout Irish Catholic family with strong Irish roots. He believed himself to be the sole authority over his wife and family, as was his God-given right. After close to 15 years of being oppressed within the marriage, Noni served Ed with divorce papers on Christmas Eve and moved herself and her children to Long Beach, California to live with her parents. So they went from Iowa to Long Beach, California. Okay, within a year or two of that, Ed hired a Pinkerton detective to kidnap all three of their children from school in Long Beach. This detective drove them to Las Vegas in an open roadster where he then put them on a train to Iowa. Mom Creck's brother got very sick from traveling in the open air roadster and developed influenza upon arriving in Iowa. Ed, their father, had no place to house or care for his children, so they were sent to live in a convent. Their brother quickly died from his illness. He was probably about 10 or 11 years old. And the two daughters remained with the nuns for the next 7 to 10 years until their schooling was finished. Noni, for all intents and purposes, had no real religious affiliation that I know of. Given the times that she lived in, she likely proclaimed some Christian church affiliation because it was socially necessary. But as far as being a practicing churchgoer, I can't say that she was devoted to any of it. I honestly can't say what her position was on Catholicism after her experiences, even if she had to convert in order to marry Ed. And mind you, divorce circa turn of the century, early 1900s, was basically unheard of, regardless of your religion. She was ahead of her time, I would say, and she lost her children because of it. Mom Crack was a product of kidnapping and boarding school isolation within a convent full of nuns. She'd been ripped away from her mother and grandparents who adored her and put into the church for years of indoctrination. She endured the loss not only of her loving mother, but of her brother as well, all in the name of the church and her father's church given authority. Mom Crack ended up marrying my mother's father, my grandfather, and I will call him Mr. Goody Good. For those who remember, this is a reference to a character that Paul Winchell used to portray in his 1960s television show called The Winchell Mahoney Time, for anyone who remembers that one. My grandfather thought Mr. Goodygood was the funniest thing he'd ever seen, and when I think of that, I think of him. So Mom Crack married Mr. Goodygood. The problem was that she was indoctrinated Irish Catholic, and he was from a long line of Mormons going back to the founder, Joseph Smith. It was like mixing oil and water from a religious perspective. My mother was the product of that union, a union that didn't last long. When I was growing up, Mom Crack wasn't so devout that she was devoted to attending Mass all the time. Oh, yeah, she went to church on the big holidays like many do, but going to Mass wasn't a regular thing from my memories. She also had family members through marriage who became priests and still are. My brother, adopted through the church, no doubt, was sent to catechism for a number of years where he made his first Holy Communion and then he made his confirmation at about 13 years old or so. I think he stopped all instruction after that. Later, in his adulthood, he managed to find salvation through a more tolerant Lord. My mother never seemed to be dedicated to any religion when I was young, and my father seemed pretty neutral on all of it for a long time. He seemed to just roll with the Catholic thing because it came with the package, and no one was overly invested in making religion or church going a priority. Unless, of course, you tried to opt out of any of it, which I was to find out later. My four sisters and I were all baptized in the Catholic Church as infants. The church mass was, for a long time, spoken in Latin, just Latin. At that time, it was all Latin. And parishioners were not allowed to read the Bible, let alone try to interpret it of their own accord, because only the church had the authority to interpret the Word of God. As a result, no Catholic in the family had a Bible of their own. When we moved to Huntington Beach when I was about 6 years old, it was decided by Mom Crack, I think, that I should go to catechism and make my first Holy Communion. This was something that only I had to do. None of my four younger sisters were required to do any of this. Why? I don't know. It could have been time and money for all I know, because you always have to pay to do anything in the Catholic Church. Um, what I remember about it was being terrified about the whole thing because it made no sense to me. Before I could make my first Holy Communion, I had to make my first Holy Confession. This meant that I, as a 6 year old, had to climb into the confessional booth and confess my sins to a priest who scared me. I had to stand in a long line of other 6 and 7 year olds who had been attending catechism with me and patiently wait my turn to confess my sins. The fear, stress, and confusion I felt while standing in that line is still with me today. I stood in that line and I fretted. What was I going to confess? Because I didn't have anything to confess. I was 6 years old. Why was I being made to do this when I hadn't lived long enough to commit a sin worth confessing? Yes, these were the things going through my mind. So I made it up. I made up sins to confess to a priest that scared me when I got into that booth. That was the first and last time I ever entered a confessional booth. The priest that scared me as a child, who ran that church in Huntington Beach, was from Ireland. I'll call him Macduff. He ran that church for many years until he died, actually. I learned later from a school friend whose family, another Irish Catholic family, but her family often had Macduff over for dinner. And it was known that he had little choice in becoming a Catholic priest. It may not have been his calling or heart's desire, but it was expected by his large Irish family, giving his pecking order within the family. He lived his life serving the church and became a lifetime alcoholic as a result. In fact, he died in a car accident, and he was the drunk doing the driving. One of my mother's best friends in the neighborhood was a woman named Kay. Kay was married to an orthodontist named Dave. They were a very devout Catholic family, and Dave ran his family the way Ed, my great grandfather, tried to run Noni, my great grandmother. They had 3 children, and I used to babysit those children whenever Kay and Dave would go out. Dave even put retainers on 2 of my sisters. When my father cleaned out the bank accounts in the early 1970s and left my mother with nothing more than 5 little girls to raise as he moved in with another woman, my mother became the sullied one and was no longer considered socially acceptable to good Catholic Dave. My mother was tainted and tarnished as if by a scarlet letter as far as he was concerned. And he forbid his wife, Kay, my mother's former best friend, from having any connection with her whatsoever. Dave righteously excommunicated my mother and us from their lives, even though we only lived 3 doors down. My mother said very little about this to me, but her sadness at the loss was evident. A couple years later, when I was about 14 years old, Macduff and I had our moment, and this was my swan song to the Catholic Church. Very few know of this experience because I never really talked about it. My mother never even knew that it happened because I never told her until I did only a few years ago. During this time, my mother was working graveyard shift at the hospital. As I've mentioned before, she was a nurse, and she was doing what she could to support us after my father had left, taking all the money with him. She'd lost her husband and her best friend and was struggling to make ends meet in a male dominated world. It was a low point, to be sure. And at 14 years old, I was of little emotional help because I did not get along with my mother at all for so many reasons. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't defend her if I felt the need to. It was early on a Saturday morning. My sisters were still sleeping in. But I was up, alone. My mother had gotten home from work about an hour earlier and had gone upstairs to go to sleep. There was a knock at the door, and I answered it. Standing there in all of his ruddy faced glory was Macduff, black robes and all. He was asking to speak with my mother, and I replied with, "What do you want?" And he asked for her again, and I said, "She's sleeping after working all night. What do you want?" This is when Macduff proceeded to tell me that he was there to collect the church's tithing because she owed and hadn't paid. I'm surprised he didn't show up with a collection plate. Well, that priest found himself on the receiving end of my 14-year-old big mouth as I unleashed my fury on his audacity at showing up at our house with his hand out when she's working herself to the bone with no help. I asked him why the church wasn't here helping her instead of trying to shame her for not paying up, always taking and never giving. His ruddy face may have been red when he arrived, but that was nothing compared to how red it was when he left. He sputtered and stuttered and then turned around and left, never to darken our doorway again. The church had done nothing to help my mother ever except beg for a handout. And that situation, whether she knew it or not, ended her connection and mine with the Catholic Church. So much for the notion of Christian charity. My mother went on a messy spiritual exploration of her own after that, but not before Mr. Goody Good tried to save us with Mormonism. Okay, so this is where I'll end part one, and I'll continue in part two. So, in conclusion, and for whatever it's worth, this is my little protest against his story. This is me telling my story my way. For the record, it's my story and I'm sticking to it. I would love to hear your stories as well, so please feel free to share your stories in the comments. Until next time, be well, choose love, and thank you. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.